Welcome, critters. I'm Claire Jones, your devoted host of the Sacred Reading CR podcast, where we examine and discuss Critical Role episodes through the lens of sacred reading practices, including the characters, plot lines, players. Everything's up for grabs here. So this particular episode is about Campaign 1, Episode 9, Part 1. And joining me today is Petall. So my question for you today is, if you won the lottery, what would you spend your days doing if money wasn't an issue?
Oh, that's a good question. Probably like D&D related things. So many D&D related things. I'd play, and not that I don't play enough D&D already, because I play quite a fair bit of D&D, but I would play more D&D. I would probably, since I would have the money to start doing it, I'd probably like start my own D&D podcast or something, get all nice equipment and stuff like that. And figure that out, like pay somebody to edit it, all those sorts of things, and probably just spend my days doing that. That would be my new quote unquote job.
I immediately thought of Joe Mangello's D&D basement. That's like so tricked out. I don't know if you've seen that he joined with Jox Machina later on in Campaign 1, and he has this huge D&D set up in his basement that's like theater level props.
Wow. Yeah, I definitely get a house, first of all, because housing is crazy, and being able to afford a house is a wonder to begin with, and then deck it out to be all sorts of D&D. I'd have a separate D&D room where with special lighting and all of these things, and a special table and all those.
Yeah, exactly. There are so many really expensive D&D artifacts from the 80s that people are collecting too. Just drop 10 grand on a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, please join us as we embark on this exciting adventure in story analysis and self-reflection in order to deepen our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. And as always, we love hearing from you and your own insights and stories as well. So please comment, like, and subscribe. And ready? All right, let's dive in. So as we open this episode, Vox Machina, they have just infiltrated a Duergar stronghold castle and successfully retrieved the paladin Kima, who they were sent to recover in this journey, but they lost Grog to the Duergar queen after killing the king. They are now on their way to get Grog back as they continue to investigate the monstrous overlord that the Duergar are working for, Kavarn, who presumably wields some otherworldly evil power via a horn of Orcus they've discovered so far. So Vax has scouted ahead and has just come upon a camp where the Duergar queen has paused with her party and a cart with Grog manacled with bands of iron around him. The group discusses their game plan while Tiberius joins Vax in his stealthing spot, but unfortunately draws the attention of one of the guards. This is now the second episode where Tiberius has blown their cover with stealth. They abandon all planning, and the rest of them move forward just as Vax throws a dagger and Vex shoots an arrow at the guard who noticed them. The guard misses a swing at Scanlan, but Vax rolls a natural 20 on his hit to completely take him out. Scanlan calls out the queen to talk to her. Vex and Trinket stand behind Scanlan to make him more imposing. Keyleth turns into an earth elemental, and Tiberius casts invisibility on himself, and they both disappear from view. Then Scanlan attempts to intimidate the other group as the queen approaches, flanked by an elf and another Duergar. Scanlan then proceeds to condescend to her, saying that they just want to retrieve their ally and continue on their way, explaining that he would promise to leave them unharmed, but he doesn't make promises with dogs. Burn. She refuses his request or threat. I'm not sure what it was. Commands. Just as an invisible mind flayer reveals itself behind the party and throws a mind blast spell at them. Vex, Trinket, Kima, and Pike become stunned, and that's when they all roll initiative. Percy shoots 4 times into the Mind Flayer, and Tiberius throws a fireball at the queen and her attendants, killing the elf. Tiberius also throws an ice knife at them. Bax stealths back over to Clarota, the friendly neighborhood Mind Flayer that they picked up along the way, and throws a dagger at the queen's Mind Flayer. Scanlan bum rushes the queen and casts banishment on her successfully, and then gives Grog an inspiration. Keyleth fades through the ground in her earth elemental form and then bursts up next to Grog, who screams in terror at her, not knowing who she is. She then picks up the entire cart with Grog still attached and starts to head back to the group. Vex makes her intelligence check to free herself of the stun effect, but Trinket fails his roll, and Pike also fails her roll. The remaining Durgar guard attacks Scanlan, but the gnome successfully blocks it with cutting words. Kima succeeds on her intelligence check to free herself from the stun. Clarota sends lightning at the other Mind Flayer just as it starts to cast a teleportation spell, which Tiberius promptly counterspells successfully, so the Mind Flayer then decides to run away. Percy shoots the guard and kills him off. Tiberius shoots another fireball at the fleeing Mind Flayer and kills it off. Scanlan tells everyone to gather around for when the queen reappears, which they do as they detach Grog from the cart. Bax picks the locks on his manacles while Pike dumps some healing into Trinket. And that's when the queen reappears from the banishment spell, and Tiberius casts Hold Person unsuccessfully before Scanlan tries to cast Hold Person again unsuccessfully. Vex shoots an arrow, Hunters marks her, and Keyleth grapples her with her earth elemental form successfully. They proceed to question her about Kavarn, but she spits in Vax's face, so Clarota steps in and casts a spell on her to make her speak. Liberation is what Kavarn offers them, she says, spreading darkness so that they will be able to walk topside again on Exandria's surface, because they are currently in the Underdark underneath the planet's surface. I keep wanting to say Earth, but that's not the name of the planet. It's Exandria. Vex asks her what Kavarn is, and her eyes change to black as another voice comes out of the queen, presumably Kavarn's, who invites them to join him in the temple. Come to me, you are my treasured guests, he says to them. The voice ends and the queen falls limp in Keyleth's arms, dead. Vex loots everything, per usual. While everyone else investigates the camp, they retrieve a silver circlet, a potion of greater healing, and a frosty blue potion off of the queen. Pike and Kima heal Grog. Keyleth drops her elemental form, and Tiberius puts on the circlet that allows him to maintain 2 concentration spells at the same time. He has to take his Ion Stone off, though, which he gives to Scanlan after Sam asks him to share. Scanlan then asks Kima to take a walk with him while Keyleth talks to the rest of the group. He creates a 3rd nipple with minor illusion and asks her to look at it to see if it's normal or not. Keyleth tells the group that she thinks they should just leave without pursuing Kavarn further, which is what Kima wants them to do. And they ask her what her problem with Kima is, especially following the previous night's argument that they got into. Vax insight checks Keyleth when she says she doesn't trust people who think their path is the most virtuous. Clarota agrees with Keyleth, and Vax says that's unfair, confirming that they will protect her no matter what to assuage her fears. She says they've killed a lot of people and wonders if they're making the right choice. The rest of the group says that they must stop Kavarn before it becomes a bigger problem. She brings up her misgivings about Kima wanting to take the evil horn that Kavarn wields back to the surface. They reassure her that they will be careful and won't let the horn fall into the wrong hands. Kima and Scanlan rejoin the group, and Keyleth apologizes to her for being harsh the previous night. They then decide to take a long rest, and that's where they break for the episode. So, what do we think about this half?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there. Lots of combat for sure.
Yeah.
But I found the parts that stuck out to me the most were more the later parts of the episode with the conversations and figuring out what to do. One thing that I've always been struck by with Keyleth, and I know you talked a lot about Keyleth in like your previous episode, I watched that one, but one thing that I really appreciate, it, whether she goes about it the right way or not, is that I really appreciate that she tends to think twice about whether killing is always the right option. And she's a little bit of a mess with how she deals with that and all of that, but I think that like at the root of it, those are good questions to be asking, especially as somebody who's training to be a leader. I know I, for one, wouldn't have a lot of respect for a leader that would just throw away lives without a second thought. And so I thought that was just, as much as it annoyed the rest of the party, I personally really appreciated that part and really liked that, especially because throughout this entire like first arc, I remember thinking it the first time through I watched it, and I have been thinking it constantly again this time through, is just like how uncomfortable I am with how the Duergar are portrayed and treated throughout the entire thing. They are dehumanized, they are pitched as being evil, or at the very least like easily swayed into evil paths. And it just, especially with all the conversations that have been happening about like quote unquote evil races in D&D and their like racist stereotypes and connotations, it's just I really like to see amidst all the rest of the party just like treating them as if they're like disposable bad guys. I really appreciate having that one person in the party who is actually stopping to ask the question, is this right? Like, should we be taking these lives?
It's definitely a pattern disruptor.
Yeah, definitely.
Because we think of D&D and participating in D&D as very much like just a bloodbath.
Yeah,
because that's kind of like the whole point of the game often, is this just seek out and kill mentality. And it is a pattern disruptor for Keyleth to be like, all right, guys, let's actually bring morals into this and talk about this as if this was happening in real time. And I think she's adding just another depth to how they're approaching the game.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what about stories, allegories, metaphors?
That's a good question. I mean, I really also appreciate just like the character growth of like Keyleth apologizing in the end, and how that shows her as like more of a like three-dimensional character. Of like, yes, she had her issues with Kima, but she's able to get through her panic about it and like and like apologize and make up. And I think that parallels, I mean, it's less of an allegory and just more like in like real life and the complexity of people and how sometimes people have like conflicts of opinion and stuff like that, but that doesn't mean that they're like, but they can't get along later and can't learn to see how the other sees the situation and everything. I know we've talked a lot in our episodes about conflict and conflict management and clashing people, partially because it's just such a common theme as Critical Role is getting their footing.
Well,
but
I mean, that's also part of D&D is conflict. Like,
oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Getting in fights pretty much every session you have.
And like, I think at this point it's just like a little bit more rough around the edges because in later campaigns it's definitely like, yes, there's character conflict and yes, there's all of this, but there's definitely a separation between like players and their characters, whereas this time, as we have talked about before, it is leaking out all over the place.
Yeah, totally. And like, I was thinking a lot about the term benevolent authoritarianism. Like, I mentioned it in the last episode, but I didn't really go into an explanation of what exactly that was. Because I study a lot of leadership styles as part of the business development work that I do. And so benevolent authoritarianism or benevolent autocrat is basically someone who says, like, I know what is best for the group. So they take the group's needs into consideration, but they are the ones that are making that overarching decision.
Yeah.
And I see these qualities very much so in Keyleth, but I also see them in Kima as well.
Absolutely.
Like, both of them are engaging with this approach with leading a group. And we were talking about this in the last episode, is like, I wonder if Keyleth is responding to the parts of herself in Kima that she doesn't like.
Yeah.
You know, maybe she's seeing her own benevolent autocrat coming out in Kima, and she's like, oh, wait, I don't like that about myself.
And it might also be, thinking about it now that you bring that up, about them both being like good leaders, is like Keyleth comparing herself to Kima and seeing all of the good leadership abilities in Kima that Keyleth either doesn't possess yet at this point, or doesn't know that she possesses at this point, and might be that insecurity rearing its head because she's supposed to become like this great leader and stuff like that. And obviously, as we know, she doesn't feel like she can do it.
Yeah. And like, Keyleth, is her point of view is that she believes that an uncertain threat that is Kavarn is not worth risking lives. Whereas Kima is well aware of the threat and thinks it is worth risking lives.
Yeah.
And that's like the fundamental difference between them. And that is a part of the argument that the rest of the group is making, is that this threat is actually known to them. It's not an uncertain threat, since they've already encountered Kavarn's stitched together creatures. So what happens when your idea of the best course of action conflicts with another's idea of the best course of action? Like, how do you handle that? That's really what we're coming to terms with this Kima Keyleth dynamic.
And I think at the root of it, both are very good and both are correct reactions. They're both coming from good intentions. They're both coming from like a genuine care. Both of them have pros and cons. It's like one of those things that I think that really, when it comes down to it, there is no right answer. The party just needs to decide what they're doing, because they are a party and they can't just be split two directions. And so I think that's very fascinating to explore as well, because quite often in media and just in life, people often portray conflicts as one side is right and one side is wrong.
Yeah, totally.
But what happens when there are disagreeing sides, but both sides are right? Because that does happen. It's not always right versus wrong. It's not always a question of who's right. Sometimes it's a question of like, what path are you going to choose, or what path like makes the most sense, or whatever other criteria you decide to base your decision on.
And Keyleth does seem to be taking a more consultative approach in this episode as compared to the previous episode, presenting her solution to the group to see if they will agree with her. And she does not back down once they make it clear that she is, or she does back down once they make it clear that she is basically outvoted in this situation. And even apologizing to Kima in the process when she realizes that her emotional expressions were unfiltered reactions more so than thought out responses. And so this really brings up the question of like, is it a question of trust here that we're grappling with? And trust and belief is a huge theme for Keyleth throughout this campaign.
Absolutely.
Huge. And I really think that we're missing some key context here. Like, we're missing the context of her killing a child pre-stream, but we're also missing the context of, I think she failed her last Aramente challenge with the Earth, and that was also pre-stream. And so she's coming off of these two like really insecure insecurity generating experiences that she went through. And I think we really need to look at this trust issue as a trauma response with
Absolutely. And I honestly think that if those were moments that had appeared on screen, Keyleth would have gotten much less backlash because would have been, of course, there's always people who complain about it. There is that quarter of the Critical Role fandom that I don't pay attention to all that much. But like
every fandom has a corner like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But like I think that if we had seen that context, a lot of people would have been a lot more understanding right off the bat. And I don't think that's the fault of the crew at all. That's just the way that it all worked out and the way that it decided to do that. But I do think that things may have gone better for the initial fandom response to Keyleth if they had seen that. And I think that is just, again, like an interesting thing to consider, just like in life, because sometimes you react to somebody's reaction of things and make a judgment based on how they're acting. But like there may be a deeper rooted reason or trauma that is stemming from.
Yeah. And I think it's brilliant that we're actually seeing the trauma in real time too with this, because that's also a pattern disruptor for D&D. You know, like the whole joke of everyone's parents are dead in D&D because that's everyone's backstory for their characters. It's like, my parents died and now I'm on a vengeance adventure to, you know, whatever. That's always the joke. And so we always assume that the character's trauma is a past thing. It's not an ongoing thing. And we see that a lot with the other characters in this group too. It's like the trauma happened in the past and they've already dealt with it. Whereas Keyleth, the trauma is still really happening.
Yeah. And I think it also, especially as like we go deeper in the campaign and like the player's past trauma comes back to help them, really just shows that oftentimes trauma isn't something that just stays in the past. It flares up at different times during life. And I think it does people in real life a disservice if we discount something as happening like too long ago to matter. You've already dealt with it, because who knows, maybe at some point there will be a stressful event or a trigger or something like that. And all those trauma responses become flooding back. And I think that's just something also important to consider, just in like having compassion for other people and understanding other people and destigmatizing trauma and mental illness and all of those things.
Totally. And so like segueing to personal experiences is like, I see this happen all the time with entrepreneurs and business leaders in particular, because they have a very strong sense of they have a strong tendency to fall into this trap of, well, I can't trust anyone else to do the job, so I need to do it myself. And that's kind of what Keyleth and Kima are grappling with too, is like, I can't really trust anyone else to uphold the morals of the group. I can't trust anyone else to take down Kavarn. I have to do it myself. Whether you're with me or against me, I'm going to be doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
And like this hyper independence, hyper vigilance, this hyper control, even hyper vengeance that we see a lot in D&D is definitely a coping mechanism. And I've seen that as myself in trauma responses over the years, but I especially see that with people in leadership positions. And I've had so many conversations with people over the years and being like, all right, can we address the trauma that you're reacting to before we make any decisions as a leader? Because that's affecting your leadership abilities. And you may or may not realize it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then like for me in my line of work, I'm often getting, because I work with kids and with youth, I'm often getting like that very fresh initial responses. If I've got a kid who's responding to trauma, like they don't know how to manage their emotions yet. They are still learning what emotions are and what these big feelings exploding from their body are. And so that often like expresses itself by like hitting another kid or like breaking down and crying or getting angry and shouting and all of these different things. And like it's my job as like a child and youth care practitioner to like sit them down and help them figure out what's going on and helping them to figure out coping mechanisms so that like especially for kids who are hitting, so that it's not as like destructive a response, but also showing them care and helping them learn how to deal with that trauma. And it's interesting to compare with like your experience with adults who are acting like they have it all together.
I mean, they just never had you when they were younger.
Exactly.
So now I have to come in and be like, all right, let's talk about our childhoods.
I'm sure many of the kids I work with will still have to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, just like, again, like just comparing to Keyleth, because Keyleth is still very young and still growing up.
Is she the youngest in the group?
I think she is.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure, but I think I know different races age differently. And so she might, regardless of whether if she is the youngest, like physically, she might still be like the youngest, like mentally. And so, and like those sort of responses still like go into like young adulthood and stuff like that. And so it's like a very similar thing is that from what I can tell, she probably had a fairly sheltered life before leaving to go on her Haramente, and now she's facing all of these harsh realities of the world and the trauma associated with that. Not to mention following the path of her mother who disappeared. And I'm sure that brings up all sorts of emotions for her.
Totally. I mean, I just know 75-year-old people who are still dealing with trauma responses. Like,
absolutely.
I don't know if it ever goes away.
No.
It's just like how you manage it at the end of the day.
And exactly.
You need to learn how to manage it. It's a skill that you develop.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just interesting to see and to compare, and also like just a good reminder in day-to-day life to be aware that other people have trauma, and sometimes when they react certain ways, it's not personal. It's them responding to a specific trigger, and their brain is trying to protect themselves, whether that's actually a response that is helpful or not.
Yeah, which brings me into the next question is like, what are we being called to do as a result?
Yeah, I think as we've talked about, just being like understanding, being aware, learning of our own trauma responses, and taking a step to analyze whether or not some of our reactions to other people are fair or not, whether it's actually rooted in like something that is genuinely like a problem, or whether it's just because they remind you of somebody that is linked with trauma, or just like just those sorts of things. Just being aware, going through the world. I'm pretty sure like every single person has trauma in one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, especially post-pandemic.
Especially post-pandemic. Yeah, that's just a traumatic experience for everyone.
Collective trauma.
And it's just like just going through life with that awareness. And if you have the emotional capacity for that compassion, having that compassion. And
I mean, for me, it's just being more sympathetic towards people who have different opinions than me. Like the whole time that I was writing my notes, I was thinking of like right-winger conservatives too. And like, because they truly believe that their path is the best path for humanity. And I truly believe that my path is the best path for humanity. And I've always been like, this is actually, I know you're Canadian, so American politics are a bit niche for you, but Mitch McConnell.
American politics are all over the internet. I know American politics better than I know Canadian politics.
Mitch McConnell in Kentucky, he's very like biblical oriented.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize that all of his policy making comes from a biblical perspective. And someone pointed that out to me recently, and I was like, oh my God, everything he does makes sense now. Because before I was like, why is he doing this stuff? Like, how is he thinking that this is a good idea? But like, once you understand where their motivations are coming from, it's a whole game changer. You're like, oh, you're acting on fear. You're acting on authoritative or benevolent autocratism. And whatever it is you're working at, it's like, it just makes so much more sense when you understand those behind the scenes motivations.
Yeah, and sometimes I find that, like, for example, in things that are as like genuinely polarizing as like left wing versus right wing stuff, considering how many human rights the far right are currently taking away in our world, that's not really something that can be like brushed under the rug with like simple understanding of where it comes from. But by understanding where that comes from, then you're more prepared to have conversations with them that might actually make a difference. Because if you understand their worldview, then you can present your ideas in a way that you know that they might understand. They might not always understand, but like, again, which I've talked about in a previous episode, that's what I do with my dad. He claims he's a centrist. He's definitely right wing. But like, whenever I have conversations with him, I try to pitch my like ideals and what I think is right in ways that are similar ways that he talks about his thing, so that he's forced to actually stop and think about it. And it's rather than for him it coming from like quote unquote like left-wing source, which he would completely disregard. It's something that is coming from a more neutral standpoint in his eyes, just because I'm pitching it differently.
And you have to use their vocabulary. Like, it's approaching anyone in a different culture. It's like, you know, if I approach someone in Russia, they were going to have a better understanding of each other if I can speak Russian or if they can speak English.
Absolutely.
And I think it's like, it's both of our onus too. It's my onus to learn Russian, and it's their onus to learn English, so that we can actually communicate and maybe compromise or maybe agree on something. Whatever that something is.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, anything you want to add before we wrap up for today?
Can't think of anything. Once again, I feel like we've covered basically, I mean, I know it's not every single possible topic we could cover for this episode, but I feel like we've gone through a good solid chunk of things.
Yeah. I mean, by the end of the series, we will have all the answers to everything.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's totally how that works.
All right. Well, these are really powerful themes that we're talking about per usual. And audience, we definitely encourage you to share your own stories and insights and feelings, thoughts with us as well. We'd love to know how Critical Role has impacted you, influenced you, changed your point of view. This is really what we're diving into here, is how we have appropriated and assimilated Critical Role and its lessons into our lives. So special thanks to Petall for joining me on this episode. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for having me. Yeah. As always, love being here.
And you'll be coming back for part 2. So as always, I'm looking for more co-hosts and guests as well. So if you're interested in coming on this podcast and sharing your own perspectives, please reach out to me via email or on Tumblr. I'll send you the sign-up form. I can't wait to chat with all of you. In the meantime, please comment, like, and subscribe below. Follow us on Tumblr at Sacred Reading CR for all the juicy updates. And until next time, may all beings be peaceful, may all beings be free, and always, always, always remember to love each other. Take care, guys.